Hello and welcome to Fair Courts, Racial Discrepancies in Sentencing and Representation. This is the third and final forum in this Spring Fair Court series from the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. I'm Joy Cardin. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, and I'll be your moderator tonight. Zoom captions are enabled, and you can turn them on by clicking on the captions icon at the bottom of the screen. If you have questions, you can type them in chat. I will share them with our panelists during and after our discussion. This program is being recorded, as the first two were as well. Those who couldn't attend live can view them on the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin's website or YouTube channel. Our first Fair Courts webinar provided an overview of Wisconsin's court system and judicial elections. Last month, we looked at how dark campaign money, politics, and weak recusal rules are undermining our judiciary. And tonight we'll examine why Wisconsin has such stark racial disparities when it comes to sentencing and serving as judges. Wisconsin leads the nation in Black imprisonment rates, according to a sentencing project study. And Wisconsin has one of the whitest state judiciaries in the country, according to the Gavel Gap Report. When we send out the recording of this forum to those who registered, we will also include the studies that we reference. The League of Women Voters of Wisconsin has a firm stance of having fair, independent, and transparent courts, and we believe in equitable treatment of all involved in our justice system. We are doing this Fair Court series in hopes of informing people on the crucial role that courts play in our rights, our society, and our democracy, and to advocate for the reforms needed to improve. Our speakers tonight have expertise or experience with the racial disparities we see in Wisconsin. They are Pam Oliver, a professor emerita of sociology at UW-Madison, Jerome Dillard, the director of the group EXPO Wisconsin, Ali Mahmoud and Wendy Huang, both third-year law students at Marquette University Law School. We are going to start our discussion with Pam Oliver, who has published many articles and a book on collective action and social movements. Since 1999, she has devoted much of her time to analyzing and speaking about statistical patterns of racial disparity in Wisconsin and the nation. She served on the Governor's Commission to Reduce Racial Disparities in Criminal Justice in 2007 and 2008, and the Dane County Task Force on Racial Disparities in 2008 and 2009. She continues to explore these issues on her blog, Race, Politics, Justice. One of the writings on your blog has to do, Professor Oliver, with a Wisconsin Supreme Court sanctioned study on racial disparities in sentencing in Wisconsin. That study, called Race and Prison Sentencing in Wisconsin, was completed in January of 2020, but not released until 2021, a year later, after the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel learned of its existence. That study found that among men, American Indian, Black, and Hispanic defendants are more likely than whites to be sentenced to prison versus other outcomes like jail, probation, or a fine. White male felons were 21% less likely than non-white male felons of ending up behind bars. I want to start with, what is your takeaway from this study? What does this tell us?
Well, so it's specifically telling us what happened at the last step of the process in sentencing. And I will say that this study found essentially the same results as a sentencing commission study found 10 years before. And to specify, it says it's on the in-out decision. Do you get to prison or do you get something else, which is what you stressed. So it's important to realize that these sentences are mostly a result of a plea bargaining process. The judge does have some say in the sentence at the end of the process, but principally what's going on is a result of a whole series of things. So at the very last step, there's a greater chance of going to prison, but that's not the only thing that's accounting for greater imprisonment disparities. If you back up down the process, you can ask, well, what was the legal representation that the person got coming into this process? Backing up further, what decisions did the prosecutor make about what things to charge, how to handle the plea bargaining process? Backing up further, what did the police do? Did they arrest the person? What charges did they offer? So it's the culmination of a whole series of things, but we definitely found evidence of a racial difference in this last step. And that, I should say, statistically, it was controlling for the character of the offense, for prior convictions, for all the things that are considered legally relevant in the situation.
So does this mean that our courts or our legal system, our criminal justice system overall is biased?
It looks that way. Now, it's important to understand that this is a statistical average. So it doesn't mean that every single judge in the system demonstrates a disparity. It could be that some judges have very high disparities in what they do and other judges don't. But on average, balancing out across the whole state, this was the pattern, that there is this difference.
You have been working on these issues, researching these issues for years, for decades. And these headlines just keep on coming up. As you mentioned, this is similar to a study from 10 years ago. Why do we continue to see this happening? Why isn't there any change?
That's a great question, because a lot of us have been working on this issue for a really long time. And it honestly gets, I see Jerome and I go way back, and it gets pretty depressing. Because you feel like you talk about the issue. We certainly have boards and commissions where we spend all this time talking about how to fix things and nothing gets fixed. I mean, it's not that nothing ever changes, but on balance, the problems are still there. So one thing to say is that actually the racial disparities in this state did go down pretty steeply between 2007 and around 2013. The trouble is, in terms of comparison to the rest of the country, the racial disparities everywhere went down pretty steeply between 2007 and 2013. So Wisconsin still stayed worse than everybody else in the country, because whatever was going on was happening nationwide, not just in Wisconsin. The drug war was a terrible thing. The drug war became more racially equal. It's still racially disparate, but it actually more white people started getting locked up for drug offenses. And so that's actually why the disparity started going down. So I don't know why it doesn't change. I mean, I get very discouraged. I think a lot of us get very discouraged. It's not that nothing changes. It's that the problem persists. Partly it's a moving target. We spent a lot of time talking about the drug war, but then other things started changing. I do think there's racial bias is part of what's going on. Racial bias kind of among pretty much every step. The citizenry, who calls the police on whom, the police and their responses to people, the prosecutors and their responses to people, the judges and their responses to people. I do think that's part of the system, which is not to say that every single person is racially biased, or that, but that has to be part of what's going on in the system. At the same time, it's also the racial discrimination and racial bias that affects people's housing options, affects people's employment options, affects people's education options. So that's also spinning into the system.
Yeah. Another study that we wanted to touch on was released last October from the Sentencing Project. It found that Wisconsin leads the nation in Black imprisonment. It released the startling statistic that 1 in every 36 Black Wisconsinites is in prison. I mean, why is Wisconsin the worst in the nation? I mean, it's not just demographics, apparently.
Well, so, I mean, again, that it is really easy to demonstrate. Why it is harder. The correlates, first of all, mathematically, how you well, no, you get a high disparity when the white incarceration rates are low, but actually the Black incarceration rates are just absolutely high, in addition to the disparity being high. And we seem to be running a punitive system that's really focusing on Black people and other racial minorities, less than on white people. Some of that has to do with the places where mostly white people live, maybe are sometimes less punitive overall, although they tend to have high disparities. A lot of because about a quarter or 3/4 of Wisconsin's Black residents live in Milwaukee County. Whatever's happening in Milwaukee is certainly driving a lot of what happens to Black statistics in the state. There was also a white paper recently released by some researchers at the Justice Lab at University of Wisconsin, who said that smaller cities in Wisconsin that have been experiencing increases in their racial diversity, cities that used to be overwhelmingly white that are becoming more diverse, are the places that have higher disparities in Black and Hispanic arrest rates. So that seems to be another pattern, is actually some kind of response, racial fear response. I mean, it's sort of like everything correlates with everything. So the high racial disparities in incarceration are associated with high racial disparities in education, high racial disparities in income, high racial disparities in unemployment. Like it's this tangled web of disparities.
The Sentencing Project, a study recommended eliminating mandatory sentences for all crimes, decriminalizing low-level drug offenses, and requiring racial impact statements for all criminal statutes. Do you think those steps would help? Or why or why not?
I'm sure they would help. The decriminalization of drugs should help. Although, again, what happened, I mean, what was going on for a while, was that people were being charged as dealers, and so eliminating the criminalization of use. I mean, what was happening for a while is the police were trying, anytime they could make a case for possession, for dealing out of a possession case, they would. So that's, these choices about how to charge whatever it was you did are part of what drive it. But I mean, of course, these things will help, but so will lots of other things, including, just deciding to stop prosecuting so much stuff. I mean, it's sort of like, I mean, what people go to prison for is usually a felony charge, but sometimes it's a felony charge that's a result of a whole lifetime of being charged with a lot of petty stuff that sort of builds up to the felony charge. And so if you back off on the petty stuff, that's another way to start backing off on the felony charges. I certainly getting rid of mandatory minimums. Another thing that's sending people to prison a lot isn't actually new sentences, it's the revocations off of probation and parole. So that's another source of the heavy surveillance. The state has extremely long periods of post-incarceration surveillance. And the research is all that the surveillance does not prevent crime. All it does is increase the risk that you will get sent back to prison on a violation of the terms of supervision. So that's another source of the mass incarceration, actually, that the sentencing report didn't mention, which is like, in general, supervision should be 6 months of supervision is probably a good thing, year max. And then after that, you're not reducing people's potential for crime with further supervision. You're just actually making it harder for them to reintegrate, harder for them to keep a job, harder for them to have good relationships with their families and move on with their life and get out of a life of crime. The supervision is actually criminogenic in some ways. So that's another thing that a lot of people are talking about.
So what do you see as the next step in trying to reduce or eliminate these disparities?
Oh, I wish I knew. So I know the activists are definitely working on terms of supervision. I do think we need to look locally and try to figure out exactly what's going on in our particular places, like where is the action? And honestly, I have not been monitoring the statistics closely enough recently. I mean, I knew 10 years ago, I knew where the action was, but it's been quite a while since I've really dug deeply into the statistics to figure out exactly where the action is. I see things like more and more people being sent to prison on weapons charges. Like, where's that coming from? Another thing that's actually, at least was, you could see an increase in people going to prison on sexual assault charges. And the very close monitoring of people with sexual offense histories is certainly a massive source of reincarceration. But you can also look at, what specifically is the nature of these sexual assault charges. I mean, I'm not, forcible rape seems pretty bad to me. I'm not a fan of violent crime, but part of what's in these statutes is also includes offenses that maybe are not as serious. It's similarly assaults. A lot of people are being charged with assault, basically in a mutual fight that maybe didn't have to be charged as assault at all. It could have been charged as disorderly conduct. So again, you don't know without really digging into it.
Let's, if you have questions for our panelists, you can put them in chat. I'm going to let's hear from all of our speakers before we get to them, though. Our next panelist is Jerome Dillard. He is the statewide director of EXPO, which stands for Ex-Incarcerated People Organizing. He has a long history of working with and for system-impacted people. Based on his own experiences with incarceration, he sees prison as a form of genocide that drains people of hope for their future. Through EXPO, he seeks to restore that hope by advocating for change in the system that structurally discriminates against so many and their families. Mr. Dillard, welcome. And what is your reaction to these newest or most recent studies showing such stark disparities when it comes to sentencing in Wisconsin?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Joy, for having me on this panel tonight. I want to say that Pam Oliver covered a lot of ground, and some things that just have been going on for decades. The war on drugs and the war on drugs in the 80s and 90s. I'm going to say the 90s because that's when Wisconsin began to build prisons from the tough on crime, the crime bill itself invested in so many states. And Wisconsin is one who did go after the money and built prisons. And it's known that there were 9 built between 1994 and 2004, and 1 bought. Privatized prisons came in and built it, and we wind up purchasing that. And there's a saying: if they build it, they will fill it. And over the last since 2008, I know Pam and I worked together on different councils and task force, and we saw a shift in things. But 2008, 2009, I began to see a shift. But revocations has always been an issue. And when they came in, when the Urban Institute and Council of State Government did the same report that just came out with the Sentencing Project, they evaluated all 50 states. Many states followed those their recommendations to shift how they shift and decarcerate the prisons in their state. We also got recommendations for Wisconsin. And at the top of the list was how community corrections function. It was stated that many judges didn't have a whole lot of confidence in community corrections, and therefore more people were going to prison. And you could be revocated in the mid 2000s to 2011, well, still today, but you could be revocated for 1 dirty UA, sent back to prison on hearsay. There's no court proceedings and revocations. I mean, there's no real due process, but the very little that they have, generally the ALJ, the administrative law judge, will go in favor of the agent and the prosecutor. those are some of the things that's wrong, but revocation has been the leading cause of new admissions in Wisconsin prison system for several years. And for a long time, I mean, between 2011 and 2020, there was no releases from prison for individuals who were sentenced prior to the new law, which, came from the crime bill and dollars being poured into the state just to pass that law itself. And they did it all over the country, 3 strikes, truth in sentencing, and other forms of sentencing. So there was a backlog of individuals who went to prison before this law came into place who were eligible for parole. And when judges sentenced these individuals, they were sentencing them with the mindset that after 25%, it's a possibility of them coming home. But then they see a parole board who would determine that there was great institutional adjustment, etc. That came to a halt. There were 4 trickling out every year with a backload of over 3,000. So there was so many just sitting there. Recently, parole has been happening, and I'm proud to say that, I'm seeing a lot of individuals who I met inside 20 years ago who felt they would never come home and have done way more time than the judges intended for them to do. I hope I'm answering your question. But,
Oh, yeah, no, you are. I mean, and I'm also, though, it's got to, I mean, that's hopeful, but it still has to be discouraging that Wisconsin still leads the nation in these disparities. 1 in every 36 Black Wisconsinites is in prison. I mean,
and a huge percentage, almost 50% of individuals who are in Wisconsin's prisons are from Milwaukee, out of Milwaukee County.
yeah,
75%, and now I'm going down the road of prison gerrymandering, but 75% of Waupung's population that's counted in the census are people in prison, 75% in that one town. It's happening all over the state. That prison gerrymandering is going on, and people who are in prison in those counties and those cities are counted as residents.
and why does that matter? Why does that matter?
Well, it matters for the maps, for the dollars that come from the federal government, and it's taken away from the communities from which these individuals are from. They should be counted where they reside before going into the prison, not used as a residence of those towns and counties up north and all around the state.
Yeah.
So
Why should it matter to all of us that Black, Native American, and Latino men are more likely to get prison sentences for felonies in Wisconsin than white men?
Well, I think it's they have a saying that you could be rich and guilty and treated better than poor and innocent. The fact of the matter is, when people of color walk into those courtrooms, we never see, especially in Dane County and all over the state, but we never see people who look like us, from who brings you out of the jail to the courts, from the time you to the courts, and on who's representing you and who's representing the state. Oftentimes, it's never someone who looks like me. And from that point, in sentencing, because we go with overworked public defenders or overworked pro bono attorneys who don't have time or the resource to do investigations or even to talk to their clients before the day that they go in court. And oftentimes the day that they're going into the courtroom is when they have conversation with individuals who are facing these charges.
So what does EXPO
Mhm.
think might make a difference when it
Well,
comes to reducing these disparities?
well, I think first it has to be a multifaceted approach from the front end and on the back end. We need to look at the specialty courts and look at how individuals qualify to go into the specialty courts. If AODA, if you're an addict, oftentimes you're disqualified. And I know that there was some shifting and changing in the term that they used, that if you had been convicted of a violent offense, you're no longer eligible for a mental health court, drug court, any of the specialty courts. Um, so changing that and funding treatment alternatives diversion so that we can have a more diverse uh, um, community settings. Um, you know, the restorative court that we had in Dane County, it worked. It did what it should do. I don't know where it's at now, but that was for young people, deferring them out of the system. I love to see expansion on that and bringing individuals with lived experience to come in and be a part of that, of those restorative justice courts where, you know, you repair the harm. Um, I'd love to see more of that, but that's not happening. Um, and again, you know, Milwaukee make up almost half of our prison system. Almost the 22,000 who are in prison today, almost half of them are out of Milwaukee County.
EXPO also advocates for restoration of voting rights
Absolutely.
for formerly incarcerated people to happen sooner rather than later. Right now in
Absolutely.
Wisconsin, you can vote when you're off paper. You would like to see people voting even while on paper.
Absolutely. Why not? It's, you know, many of the Midwest states surrounding Wisconsin, individuals can vote once they're released from institutions. I feel it's a compromise. We should never leave our vote, but we are saying that we have 45 plus thousand in the community who are disenfranchised by the simple fact that they're on some form of supervision. There's 66,000 individuals total who are on supervision in Wisconsin. 45,400 and something odd individuals of that 66,000 could vote if they weren't barred because of the simple reason they're on supervision. And another thing about the Unlock the Vote campaign is we're bringing attention also to how long individuals are serving community sentences in this state on form of supervision. And it's a vicious cycle. And before it's important. I have two staff members. One cannot vote until 2042. That's the truth. Working and paying taxes every day. The other can't vote until 2034. You know, that's a long time to be taxed, but yet still you have no say in who's in your children's school, who's on the children's school board, who represents the community from which you're from. And so we have no interest in politics. This is going on for generations. You know, the saying is take your child to the poll. Many are not seeing their parents go to the polls because of the simple fact that, first of all, there's an illusion because they've been told that if you're a convicted felon, you can't vote. No one puts up billboards and say, you're a convicted felon, but if you're off paper, you can vote. The billboard said, you're a convicted felon, and therefore you cannot vote, which is deceiving. But it's been impacting generations of future voters because they don't see their parents.
I'm gonna talk, bring in a question from one of our attendees because it's so on point right now, rather than waiting until the end of the hour. Nick says, thank you for mentioning the alternative court systems. How can we ensure that the assessment process for these alternatives are free from bias? Most of the time individuals are making these decisions. They can be subjective elements to these assessments.
Mhm. Well, first of all, like jury duty. Many of us are just eliminated from jury duty, and there's not that many in the room to start with. When I was called to jury duty, it was just a few of us. So I'm saying the process should include people from all walks, people from the community who have found some degree of success, who have a arrest and conviction history. I feel that we are the experts. We should be at the table when these things are being discussed. Bring in individuals who more people of color at the table when these things are being determined. I think.
Well, that's a good transition to our next speakers. We will take more questions about sentencing disparities at the end of the program, but now we're going to hear about more about racial disparities in representation on the bench and in law schools and in the legal system in general. We are joined now by two Marquette University Law School students. Ali Mahmoud is a third-year law student at Marquette. He was president of the Marquette chapter of the American Constitution Society. The American Constitution Society issued the Gavel Gap Report some years ago that gave Wisconsin an F for diversity on our courts. He also co-founded the Muslim Law School Students Association, served as its co-president. He also served as secretary of the Asian Law Students Association. Also joining us is Wendy Huang, who is a third-year law student at Marquette as well. She has also been active in numerous organizations, including the Marquette Immigration Law Association, the Muslim Law Students Association, and treasurer of the Asian Law Student Association. She also served as student volunteer with the Eviction Defense Project, the Domestic Violence Injunction Project, and the Marquette Volunteer Legal Clinic. Boy, busy, busy, busy. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to start with you, Ali. Recently, you were involved in putting together an event at Marquette titled The Gavel Gap Revisited. And that was one of the reasons that we did reach out to you for this forum. Tell us a little bit about that Gavel Gap report and what it found and whether Wisconsin's doing any better today than it was then.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you all for having me. I really do appreciate this opportunity to discuss a little bit more about the American Constitution Society and the Gavel Gap. But just a little bit about the American Constitution Society. It's one of the only progressive legal organizations that exist sort of at the law school level and sort of outside of like for lawyers in general. Many law school programs and lawyer programs don't really focus on the progressive nature of the Constitution, whereas the American Constitution Society does. And they take on tasks like the Gavel Gap. What the Gavel Gap does is it sort of analyzes and calculates the demographics of a certain state and compares it to the state courts and the judges there to see how different and how representative the judges in those courts are to the people living in those states. In 2018, when the study was done for the first time, Wisconsin was the lowest ranked state and we received an F grade. Today, we are still at that F grade. However, we're not the last place. We're number 44 out of 51. 51 because we include DC in the calculation. And, for some more numbers, when it comes to men and women of color in the state of Wisconsin, so that's including African Americans, Hispanic and Latino populations, Asian populations, indigenous populations, there's 18%. And to represent that in the state courts, there's only 5% of state court judges that are judges of color. This is like something that is, understandably quite problematic. It's difficult for alleged criminals to have to deal with facing sentencing from a judge who may not have a similar background or understanding of certain cultural norms. I had the pleasure this past year to serve as an intern for the public defender's office for the Milwaukee office. And as Mr. Dillard had explained, it is very common to see that alleged criminals are the only person of color in the courtroom. I would be sitting next to our clients, and it would be me and our client and a courtroom filled with white men and women. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to find a client guilty or not guilty, but it does definitely weigh heavy on like the mind of like the accused, because it's sort of it puts a lot of pressure on them, and it just makes any sort of situation more uncomfortable without seeing the familiarity of the faces.
Yeah. So why does that exist? Why is the Wisconsin judiciary, the legal system, so white?
In large part, I think that it has to do with the people that go to law school and then take the leap from law school to become judges. In law school, generally, at Marquette Law School, I can speak for Marquette. It is 1 in 5 students are students of color, which it might sound like that's a high percentage, but in the average first-year law student class of 60 people, that means that there's only 12 students of color. Of those students of color, how many of them will graduate and then go on to become judges is even fewer. So the majority of students that graduate from law school and become lawyers, they are white, and you see that same sort of demographic continue on over to the judges side. The same sort of judges that get selected or that choose to become judges tend to be white. Governor Evers in recent years has made a more committed effort to appoint and to promote judges that are of color. And since then, we have made this progress, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Wendy, your thoughts on the gavel gap and why it matters?
Yeah, so I think it matters tremendously. Like Ali was saying, there's such a low percentage of representation at the state court level. For example, women of color, I think, make up 9% of the state population, but a mere 1% are in the state court level. And I think that when these laws affect people of color, people from low socioeconomic backgrounds, but when that doesn't reflect back in the judiciary and in the legal profession, then that there's a problem. And obviously, I think that starts with the lack of resources. And like Ali says, in our own classrooms, there's usually only a handful of people of color and an even lower number of women of color. And I feel like there should be something done about that to address that.
Yeah. In our first webinar during this series, we heard from retired Dane County judge, actually Court of Appeals Judge Paul Higginbotham, who was the first African-American to be an appeals court judge in Wisconsin. He said he believed that barriers to entering and completing law school is one of the main factors that we have so few judges of color. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. A law school education is expensive. I think everyone knows that, especially at a private institution like Marquette. I think that it's known that people of color are affected socioeconomically a lot of the times. And I feel like an access to education is a part of it. So when there's a barrier to undergraduate college, then that just makes it even lower to get to law school. And once you're in law school, you take out loans. And when you want to find a job, your focus is probably on how much the job is paying versus the representation you would like to see in the judiciary.
And to add on to what Wendy was saying, there's also the socioeconomic factors exist. There's also the factors of support that is like non-monetary support. I know that when I came to law school, there were very few law students, even like mentors that were Muslim or were from Asian backgrounds. I'm a first generation law student, and many of the students of color that I interact with at the law school are also first generation law students. So the pathway to get to law school, to get information about what law school is all sort of the first stride for us. Whereas many of our like white classmates had the opportunity to work in law firms or had family members that were lawyers or family friends. I am the first expected lawyer in my family.
Can you talk some about the barriers that students of color face or that you have personally faced, Ali?
Yeah, it's no surprise that in a state such as Wisconsin, where there is somewhat of a lack of diversity and diversity training amongst students, a lot of microaggressions occur. Students oftentimes will make sort of comments even on accident or even in some sort of devil's advocate sort of fashion, where they will make statements that are very hurtful. And these statements, they do have a very serious impact. We oftentimes talk about very intense subjects. The law has oftentimes been used as a tool to hold back people of color and women of color and women generally from advancing. And only in a recent trend in our legal history have we seen some sort of progress for people of color and women of color and women. And because of this, like, we have these discussions that oftentimes can lead to very sensitive material. And this sensitive material, if it's not approached appropriately, can lead to very difficult times for the students.
Yeah. Wendy, do you want to share any experiences or barriers that you have faced?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that Ali said. I think that there's an idea of who a lawyer is, who a judge is, who is a legislator. And a lot of the times it's not me or Ali or Mr. Dillard. And I mean, for example, like, I've been told that I've gotten my scholarships because I am a minority. I've had professors try to guess like what my ethnicity is, like totally inappropriate things that kind of intimidate people who have no background, who are first generation, who go to law school because they want to do something, but kind of are faced with judgment and in access to resources. And I think that when there's a more clear way for students like Ali and I to find a place in these institutions, that's when we can see a change in the judiciary and in the legal field as a whole.
Yeah. Why don't we do have some questions coming in, and I'd like to get to them. If you have questions, please put them in chat, and we will get to as many as we can before we sign off. Let's start with Wendy on what do you see as the fix to the discrepancy or the disparities in representation in our legal system?
I mean, that's a good question. I think that's the big question. I think that resources, obviously. I think that if there were actual attorneys or a commitment from the legal professions to go to high schools, undergraduate places, and tell them that like this is a pathway for you. If there were specific groups that would provide mentorship or scholarships, because I know that, you know, people like Ali and I can do this. I mean, we're here as proof. It's just a way of supporting people who have this idea for themselves to be represented.
Ali, in terms of the fix?
I think what Wendy said is absolutely correct. I think the resources is the biggest barrier. Law school is, you know, I've had the privilege of being able to attend law school, but I know that, you know, many people from my community and other communities struggle with sort of getting this access to law school and getting even, you know, basic legal information. Having these resources and information provided to people throughout like our communities is something that's very important, to remind them that there are inalienable rights that are guaranteed to them and that they have these sort of protections. Another thing is focusing on holding, you know, courts and our elected officials responsible and advocating for them to promote diversity and understand that qualified diversity is very important on these sort of benches and for our officials.
We have a question from Kathleen. What methods have been successful in diversifying the racial makeup of juries? You mentioned, Ali, that when you're interning with the public defender's office, you noticed the whiteness of the courtroom. Are there any, you know, methods that try to diversify the juries?
To my knowledge, our biggest focus is to sort of bring as many people to show up to jury duty as possible. One, you know, big barrier that is currently existing, as mentioned both earlier by all of our panelists, is that there are many socioeconomic factors that prevent people from showing up to jury duty. You show up to jury duty by having an address, and oftentimes if you're house hopping or if you're being evicted, you won't have a permanent address. And most commonly, people who are doing better socioeconomically will be able to have that permanent address. So it's sort of a difficult thing to sort of resolve, because how do we provide better housing and adequate housing for people across the board so that they can show up to jury duty is, you know, it's its own sort of ball of problems.
Yeah. Why did you decide you wanted to, you're gonna, when you graduate, you're gonna move on to practicing criminal law in Sheboygan as a public defender? Why did you choose that route?
I think that there is this this narrative that if someone is accused of a crime, or even if they have committed a crime, that they are guilty without a doubt, that because a crime was committed, because someone was wronged, they must be punished for it. I think that everyone deserves a fair trial and deserves to have adequate representation during that trial. I think that, you know, it's not fair to point the finger at one person and blame them for some action that happened, when in reality there's a number of factors that go into any sort of situation that can occur. And I, you know, after having that realization, after speaking with actual accused defendants and their families, I felt that I needed to be a little bit more involved than I could be.
And Wendy, what are you planning on doing upon graduation?
I am currently working with the Wisconsin Realtors Association, and I'm intending on continuing with them.
We are, I think we can open it up to questions for everyone, and we do have some. We have, Nick wants to know, he said, Mr. Dillard mentioned involving people of color with lived experience in the process of making change? What are some ways to compensate people with lived experience appropriately for their time and very specialized knowledge? Mr. Dillard, can you unmute and answer that one?
Story of my life. You're muted. Yes. When I say lived experience, I'm talking about people such as myself who have been to prison, who have come home, who gets it, and are giving back to my community. There's a system in place called peer support, something that we've bought into Wisconsin. Seems that the Department of Corrections has bought into it because it's my opinion. I understand where many of these young people, men and women, are going through or need to hear from someone who have that lived experience, meaning who've gotten out and stayed out. Oftentimes when I went inside prisons to speak, you know, I was told by the population, man, we don't see a lot of success stories from individuals who have been incarcerated. Number one. And number two is we speak the same language per se. We can, because we come from those communities and have that lived experience, we can do comparisons. I could talk to them about some of the traumas that I went through and how it impacted me and how we can avoid that being impacting their lives. I know it's a long answer, but that's one way of doing it. Certified peer support specialists are, it's billable through Medicaid, Medicare, CCS. It's something that is billable at a hefty hourly rate.
Jane asks, can you speak to the costs incurred by people charged with or convicted of crimes? Do we have a kind of debtor's prison?
Well, that's a good question. They will extend your supervision if you have not paid all your court costs, restitution, court costs, etc. They will extend it. They have been extending it. You have to go before a judge to get that sent to a civil judgment. And it's the lack of resources. I saw in the chat where there's no investment on the back end. People are coming home homeless. That does not make our community safer. And it's really, really a big thing in this state right now. And so that's something we're looking into.
And I'll just add that this issue of court costs is one of the things that I don't think any of the local activists are really working on it that hard right now, but it's a big issue that's getting more and more attention around the country, and people are talking about it here. You get, even for the small change stuff, you can pile up $1,000 in debt. And if you're a low income person, either jobless or working minimum wage, paying that off is hard, and it's dragging down lots of families. And they charge you to be incarcerated. They basically say, we're locking you up and we're going to bill you. So it's a serious issue.
Thank you, Pam.
A question or comment underlying all of this is breaking down unconscious biases. Another huge part of recidivism is upon release, what resources are being offered if your basic needs are not being met. Not only are you likely to reoffend, but you are seeking to get your basic needs met, but then you are unable to address issues such as addiction and mental health. And that may have been the root of why you were incarcerated.
Yes, that's a very, very true statement there. The fact of the matter is, we're not investing on, there was a lot of money poured into getting us to where we are today. There's very little investment in making change for those who are returning to the community. And there's 600,000 people who are released every year. And we can't ignore the collateral consequences that comes with being a convicted felon.
Yeah, and what are some of those collateral consequences?
Well, some places can't hire you because of the HIPAA Act, HIPAA itself. Being a mailman, I told a young man last night, that's to be a mailman after getting a felony conviction is likely not to happen. I mean, they may hire one or two of us, but you don't see many who are mailmen. I mean, there's job discrimination, housing discrimination is huge, and it keeps you in a cycle of poverty and chronic stress. I mean, really, it is a healthcare issue. And people who are on supervision in Wisconsin, believe me, and Columbia Justice Lab did a study and a report for EXPO around the health impacts on being on supervision. And it's chronic stress and a lot of other things, other diseases that come along with being stressed and on community supervision.
Yeah. Are there any recent policies in the past few years, for example, that have been especially problematic or especially good regarding sentencing? Professor Oliver, does something come to mind?
Well, so in terms of the good, I'll also pick up a really early question that happened back when I was talking. I mean, the main source of the big decline in the racial disparity and Black imprisonment was people backed off on the drug war, specifically backed off on the racially targeted drug war. You could really see that it was intentionally happening in Milwaukee. It was intentionally happening in Dane County. I think it was a consequence of all of the discussion and activism around the issue, and it was happening around the country. It had become a really big issue in the indictment of the drug war, and there was a backing off on that. And so that's a place where you could just see in the numbers kind of initially back in the 1980s, you could see in the numbers the consequence of the policy going one way. And then later you could see the consequences of the policy going the other way. So that's an example of, you could see in the numbers something happening in response to discussions and activism around the drug war. Bad policies. So there's bad policies that are lock lots of people up, but it's almost like, even if it's a race neutral bad policy, it will tend to disproportionately affect the most oppressed and marginalized people in the community. So, some white people got locked up under the bad drug laws, but white people who did the same thing were less likely to be caught and more likely to sort of get off, have them get some sort of resolution other than sending them to prison for those bad drug laws, even though the laws on their face were racially neutral. And the same thing is happening with all the other bad laws. So people are on, in this state, people are on post-prison supervision for 20 and 30 years, which is ridiculous.
Right.
It's ridiculous. And so that's an example of a terrible law that's just shipping people to prison and ruining their lives. Right now we're, I know Jerome knows about this because I just heard from EXPO about this, but there's a bail law that's likely to pass in Wisconsin that's horrific. So Wisconsin, the short version is, Wisconsin is unusually good in its bail law. There's actually a constitutional right to bail. And we have actually a worse situation of people sitting in jail pre adjudication than most states. But the state legislature right now, in response to that one horrific incident in Waukesha, is trying to change the state constitution to make it possible to keep people in jail without bail before trial. So that's an example of a bad law that's actually people are trying to pass right now. It's like the crime of the moment is almost always going to any law that is passed in response to one horrific incident, I promise you will be a terrible law.
That's right. That's right. And thank you, Pam, for raising that up, really, because it's really, really a serious issue. First of all, I don't know why we're tinkering with the Constitution around bail reform. Second, it's well, bail reform is the hidden the name that the label that's been put on it.
Bail non-reform, bail anti-reform.
Yeah, it is. And but it passed out last session real fast. But it doesn't end there. And so we're trying to bring attention to the public that we're going to have to vote on that as citizens in this state in order for it to actually come into effect and change the Constitution. So I think that, I know that our mission is to educate all around the state around this horrible bill, because it will hurt me. I've been out for 25 years. I've been in trouble in 25 years, but it can still come back and affect me.
And the same thing happened with Marcy's Law,
Mm-hmm.
a couple of years ago. So this was, it had a totally misleading description on the ballot. It basically said, are you for or against giving victims more rights? That was actually what was on the ballot.
Mm-hmm.
And what it was actually doing is taking away defendant rights.
And Wendy and Ali, if you have any thoughts on the policies and sentencing disparities, feel free to just unmute and chime in. We have another. Well, actually, Kathleen wondered, Professor Oliver, if you are aware of any successful methods to diversify juries. I presented that question to just one panelist and not you.
So there's two different issues. So one problem about diversifying the jury that's actually hearing a trial is that prosecutors preemptorily challenge Black potential jurors because they believe that Black potential jurors are going to be soft on particularly Black defendants. And so it's a scandal across the country that prosecutors just routinely try to get Black people off juries. So even if they're in the jury panel, they try to get them off. So one thing to be trying to challenge is just these peremptory challenges. But then backing up, getting enough people into the panel, partly if the community, so many of Wisconsin's communities are so disproportionately white, and the racial disparities in who's in the system. So, I mean, I did an analysis, it never went to trial, but I did an analysis for a lawyer once that was just calculating the math of how hard it is to get enough jurors in the panel in Dane County to survive 2 peremptory charges. Yeah. And there's the demographics of it is part of the problem. But then, I talked to the clerk of courts at one point who was making a tremendous effort to try to diversify the panel by just trying to get as creative as he could to think about how he would recruit jurors into the panel, right? So it's not that nobody cares about the issue, but there's both the aggressive outreach to try to get people into the panel, persuade them to come. Previously, Jerome talked about all the barriers to coming. And then it's like the demographics become, when you're in a community where a majority of the people facing criminal charges are Black, but only a small minority of the community is actually Black, the jury problem just gets really huge.
Yeah. There's a question from one of our attendees. In Illinois, they passed a ban the box bill on employment applications. Do we have that in Wisconsin? The question should be delayed until after the initial job interview. Do we have, I know Madison was talking about ban the box.
There's some ban the box efforts. What's interesting about that, so first of all, a lot of people are, I mean, the box, first of all, even if the box isn't there, like people know that in Wisconsin, you can look people up on the court records and find out their record. But there's some research that suggests that ban the box helps white felons, but doesn't help Black felons. Because many employers assume that a Black person probably is a felon. And so the box actually helps the Black non-felons. So it's a complicated problem. I'm still in favor of banning the box if you're asking my opinion, but the racial dynamics in a society that's racially biased, again, the consequences of something that seem either good or bad can always play out in perverse ways in a racially biased system.
Yeah. And
So we do
as
have
a
ban the box, and we do have ban the box in several counties, the city of Milwaukee, Dane County, and other counties, a few other counties, Racine, do have ban the box as cities and counties. I just wanted to add that.
someone suggested we should recruit more people of color to run for clerk of courts, and had a exclamation point, or how about judges? How about, I mean, talk some maybe, I don't know if if anybody has any thoughts on whether there is active efforts going on to have more judges run, or people of color run for judgeships.
Okay. Well, I'll just tap in and say, oftentimes they run unopposed. You know, the DA has not been opposed in several election cycles. Judges, most of them, no one challenged them, and so they remain in those seats. Why people are not running for it, I don't know. Many seem to leave the state after they get their law degrees and head to higher ground, I guess you'll call it. But yeah.
Ali, do you have any
2
thoughts on are you gonna run for a judge someday?
I'm not sure about that. You know, I definitely do recognize that there's a lot of concerns throughout like our justice system. I think that a part of the apprehension in becoming a judge is that sort of worry of being sort of a cog in that system. I think that, you know, on a personal level, I feel like I am a better advocate working on the defense side. That being said, I know that there are increasing numbers, especially between law students and lawyers, who feel a level of confidence in becoming a judge after seeing that there's a level of increase in the diversity on the bench, especially, you know, after the confirmation of the Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown. You know, there is some hope that there is progress that can be made.
Wendy, you have any thoughts on increasing diversity on the bench by, you know, encouraging more people of color to run for judge?
Yeah, I think that there is a certain pipeline to a judgeship, or running for a judge, running to be a judge. And a lot of that starts with being a clerk or clerking for a judge. And I feel like a lot of students of color, law students of color, don't necessarily see themselves there in the court, or don't have that experience, or these jobs aren't known for being paid well. And I think that's a part of it too. When you have lower income students coming in, they want to make a career for themselves after law school. And when a clerkship, which is a step usually to becoming a judge, is only getting paid so much, I feel like that is a deterrent. So I think increasing resources for that pathway would encourage more people to pursue that.
Yeah, well, we're running close to the end of our webinar time here. Let me go do a quick round robin, and your final thoughts on this problem of racial disparities in sentencing and in representation in Wisconsin, and what you'd like to see happen, you know, the next step. Maybe Wendy, why don't we start with you?
I'm sorry, you just cut out a little bit. Can you repeat that?
Just what do you hope happens next? What is your final thoughts on how we correct this problem of lack of representation and these racial disparities in sentencing?
I think just increasing access to education, access to housing, things like that, where there are already barriers for people of color, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And once the path is open, it'll be easier to see that representation reflected adequately to the actual population.
Yeah. And Ali, is there anything that, you know, along those same lines that we can do as individuals or collectively to help reduce these disparities in representation or sentencing?
I think the biggest thing is to recognize that, you know, at the end of the day, these are like, you know, we're speaking in numbers that it's, you know, 18% of the people in the state are people of color and things like that. That there are people behind these numbers. There are people that are, when we say that Wisconsin has the most disproportionate prison system, like those are people that we're talking about. Having that sort of humanization of the numbers is something that's definitely helped me become a stronger advocate. And I think that expressing that, you know, sharing that message to other people will definitely help spread that message to them as well.
And Jerome, your final thoughts on what we can do to
Well,
fix this situation?
I do have some thoughts on what we can do. First of all, there are other cities and states who have been able to reduce their racial disparities by enacting better laws and also investing in the individuals who are returning to their communities. I want to point to something here. Between I think it was 2007 and 2008, late 2008, Pam and I were on it. Correct me if I'm wrong about the years, Pam. We were on a task force, a Dane County task force on racial disparities. We came up with, I believe it was 82, it's been a while, 82 recommendations on how we can alleviate the racial disparities in Dane County. I believe that maybe 2 or 3 of those recommendations that were implemented, and you know, I don't know why weren't they enacted, but we can look at other models. I mean, there's cities and there's states who are doing a whole lot better. We just seem to be immune for any change as far as our criminal justice system goes. It's been, you know, it's been this way for decades, and we seem to be immune to look at or do any changes to our criminal justice system. I guess that's.
Well,
Thank you.
we're gonna have Pam Oliver leave us with a little bit of hope, I hope.
Uh-oh, you got the wrong person. My friends call me Debbie Downer, but so I guess I was going to speak on I guess I would speak 2 or 4 old white people, since that's my demographic, and just say that, getting out of your own little box and trying to put yourself in a place where you interact with people. I've learned a ton. I mean, the most important thing for me in working on this racial disparity stuff is meeting people like Jerome, and not just Jerome, but lots of other people of really different backgrounds, and broadening my own experience. So I feel like learning about the issues, learning about, as Ali said, that these are human beings, getting outside of the stereotypes, and really understanding that, first of all, trying to learn enough so that we can be more open and welcoming to people of color and people from marginalized backgrounds. And then, so that's like the representation at the professional end of the system is trying to help be more open. And for the folks who've been impacted, who've been incarcerated, who've been arrested or been marginalized, trying to learn more about folks' lives, and people are human beings. They're not stereotypes and they're not statistics. And, kind of learning how to open your heart and get outside of your own little box and empathize and understand what's going on with people, and then support policies that will actually make life better for people. I mean, it's one thing, you know, you can care, but if we don't change the policies, we're just going to keep like grinding people down and down and down. So that's what I think.
I think that's a perfect place to end this discussion. Thank you all very much for being with us. Here's something that you can learn a little something coming up next on our webinar calendar on May 12th at 6 p.m. How We Got Here, the Hidden History of Diversity in America. The speaker will be writer-researcher Reggie Jackson, who is the co-founder of Nurturing Diversity Partners, a firm that fosters diversity, inclusion, and equity within institutions and communities. Info on registration is on the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin's website. So please join us for that. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, I'm Joy Cardin. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all the attendees. And thank you to Molly Carmichael, who is the communication manager for the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, who did all of the heavy lifting on this series. So thanks, and hope to see you next time. Bye.